I started construction by taking a cheap cutting board and drilling some holes in it and cutting into the shape I wanted for the mountain base. The skull was a Halloween decoration I sculpted some stone detail on with epoxy putty. Originally I put some foam rod horns on the skull, but thought better of it not long after. I used a hot wire foam tool to cut out a shallow channel on the lower piece of foam. Once that was cut to fit, I spread wood glue on both pieces of foam and joined them together. To keep the foam in position while the wood dried, toothpicks were pushed through from the front, securing the pieces. To make room for the lower jaw, small grooves were cut in the lower portion of the foam, which allowed it to slide into the base, forming the tunnel entrance to the dungeon. Now that the jaw fit into the base, the jaws were modified to have fangs made from epoxy putty and attached. Next, the opening for the skull was expanded by cutting the foam with a utility knife. Now the board was marked with a Sharpie where the foam would be attached, and hot glue was applied in a thick coat, making sure the seam between the foam and the base was solid. I got the hot wire tool out again, only this time I used the wand attachment to cut a hole for the tunnel entrance, and also to enlarge the grooves in the foam for the lower jaw. More foam scraps were then added to the base to bulk up the face and sides of the mountain. Now I moved on to the groundwork and got out some Activa brand paper mache. This is pretty much identical to Celluclay, Sculpt-A-Mold, or even the ground products from Luke's APS and others. It mixes about the same as the others by adding the powder to the water and mixing it in until it's about the consistency of some thick oatmeal. I add some PVA glue to the groundwork so it doesn't lift up or shrink too much and peel back as it dries. I had run out of Sculpt-A-Mold, so I figured beggars can't be choosers, and happily used what I had on hand. I used a craft stick to spread the groundwork over the base and the foam. I realized that I forgot to smooth the edges of the foam pieces, so I used the hot wire tool again before applying the rest of the groundwork. I made some boulders and rock faces by pouring Durham's wood putty and also by pressing some 5-minute epoxy putty into Woodland Scenic's rubber rock molds. I used both methods because I wasn't sure the epoxy would work for this because it sets very quickly, whereas the Durham pours in and has much longer working time. I used more foam scraps cut to fit the tunnel shape and hot glued them into place. Then I checked the overall fit of everything and moved on to securing and blending the epoxy putty fangs into the skull and jaw with more Aves epoxy clay and epoxy sculpt. They are products made by the Aves company and are virtually the same except for the color. As I continued with the build, I checked the look and fit of the skull and jaw for the final placement. It was now time to build up the groundwork around the skull and give it a more natural look by blending it into the mountain and the rocks. On this batch of groundwork, a tan acrylic paint was mixed in to give the whole piece a cohesive look and tie it all together. It also helped tone down and even out any places that might get missed when paint was applied. Now they'd be tan instead of bright white. There needed to be a lot more boulders on the mountain, so I hot glued a good amount more to the base, which gave it a more rugged, mountainous look. Groundwork also blended the boulders together with the base and skull. Once the main parts were blended, the front of the base looked kinda empty and plain, so I added a rock outcropping made from some more XPS foam. This was also covered with the Activa groundwork, then sealed, painted, and weathered with acrylics, then foam and turf moss was also added. I then blended the rocks with the skull by using more epoxy sculpt epoxy putty to make it look as though it was carved from the mountain rock. Now it was time to give the piece a coat of sealer, made from Mod Podge and acrylic paint mixed half and half to strengthen it and tie the whole piece together. I also had a mix of dark brown sealer for the ground so it would start out looking like dirt and be that much easier to paint. Onward we go to the guiding light, which will lead our warbands into the mouth of the tunnel leading to Dark Skull Dungeon, where their fate awaits. I took an LED tea light and cut a hole for it in the foam of the side of the tunnel entrance. I did this while the groundwork was still damp and easy to dig out, so the hole could be filled in around the light once it was secured. With the light in place, it was covered with some foam core with the paper peeled off, exposing just the foam. A small foam core doorway was cut and attached to the bigger piece of foam sheet that is the back of the mountain, and all these were attached to each other with hot glue. Once the sealer coat was dry, I mixed up a wash of tan acrylic paint and water. I coated the entire piece with this wash. It settles into the cracks and crevices and stays on the upper flat surfaces while it thins out a bit when it travels down the side surfaces to give a good starting point for shading and highlighting before the first real coat of paint is on the terrain. Next I did a similar wash with dark brown, but on this one I was more deliberate about the placement of it and mostly used a thinner brush to get in the finer and deeper cracks and crevices of the mountain face. I put some army painter stones and pebbles on next using some tacky scenic glue called Scenorama. It worked really well and dried fast, but remained rubbery and flexible, so the pieces seemed to bend more before just popping off like they would with straight PVA. So for me it was kind of a happy accident. After it was set up, I gave the stones a gray wash and some dry brushing to tone them down, because the original color was more orangey tan. After that, I decided the piece needed something. Mossy flocking! So I blended some Woodland Scenics Earth Blend turf with JTT Green turf, both available at Hobby Lobby, and sprinkled and pressed the mix into some of the Scenorama cement. On the larger sections, I used the Woodland Scenics Thin Scenic Cement. While it was drying, I brushed a wash of Plaguebearer Flesh Contrast and some Athonian Camo shade paints onto the mossy areas. They help tone down the brightness of the turf combinations enough so it looks more realistic and a part of the scene, not just something stuck on the rocks, but living there and growing from the cracks and crevices. The soil was next, and was just that. Potting soil that I passed through a tea strainer to get the finest grains of dirt to make the layer look as in scale as possible. Woodland Scenic's thin cement was used to stick the layers down to the base, and then a soaking layer of the cement was sprayed over the whole ground area of the base after all the soil layer was applied. I had only planned on putting dirt and static grass on the base for ground cover, but then I thought, what self-respecting evil skull entrance to a deadly dungeon wouldn't have a cute little swamp? So here comes the resin water. This resin is the JTT resin water, available also at Hobby Lobby, and is definitely the easiest way to make believable water on pretty much any type of surface. You just pour it straight from the bottle, or color it and pour it from your cup, and then just brush it out so it's evenly spread over the surface. The only thing to really watch is the thickness of the pour, because if it's much thicker than 3 millimeters, it can crack while it dries. Other than that, though, using a bead of PVA around the edges of the pour gives it a little something to grab onto and transition up to the dry land smoothly. Now there was a layer of water poured, I moved on to laying down some static grass. I just spread thin scenic cement in a good soaking layer everywhere that I wanted the grass to be, and then used the applicator to cover it all. After I tapped off the extra grass, I sealed the whole base with more of the thin scenic cement. This was also a good time to give my static grass applicator a try, putting down the grass, and it worked just about as good as I could have hoped. I wanted to try to make my own grass, so I went with some twine string from the dollar store, cut to about 1.5 to 2 inches long, and soaked that in a mixture of greenish-brown acrylic paint and water for a couple of days. After it had dried completely, I then went and got a cheap coffee grinder and ran the string through that, which did a really nice job of chopping it down to about 2 to 3 millimeters, with some fuzzy strings just kind of mixed in. To separate these parts, I just used a strainer to let the smaller lengths fall through into a bowl, and pretty quickly I had enough of the finished grass to do the whole base. It was also pretty close to the color I was going for, so all I really needed to do was a little bit of green and brown washes and some pastels and Vallejo pigments. I also had some grass tufts from Army Painter that I wanted to give a try, so I peeled some of those and stuck them around the base where I thought longer tufts of grass would be growing, like in and around the swampy area and under rocky ledges and up on the mountainside. Even though they have adhesive on the bottom, I still used some of the Scenorama glue to make sure that they were secure. After the first layer of resin had cured, I put down another coat, and into this one I put some broken twigs and branches and other debris into the swamp. Now I moved on to the third and final coat of resin, which was poured like the previous ones and brushed all over and around the twigs and debris so that it would stay put in the cured resin. On the top of the resin, I sprinkled some leafy forest mixture, which I've had on the shelf since last year. I think it added a nice touch with the little realistic leaves and some other swampy forest litter. This is just a quick way I use to make reeds or long sawgrass, using an old or a new paintbrush. Start by putting the masking tape around the tip of the bristles at about where you want the height of the grass to be. Then cut straight across just under where the tape ends. Trim the exposed bristles so that they are even all the way across. Next, put a bead of glue across the bristles and spread it evenly, being careful to keep the glue on top of the bristles, not on the sides. Repeat if necessary.
Three hours later.
Once it's dry, gently remove the tape and you'll have a line of long grass that you can cut into little sections or clumps and place them where you want, at the edges of water or streams, making some believable sawgrass or reeds for about $1.